So yes, today's topic, this is part of a lecture series that I've been doing for a while now called Understanding MENA. And this is about the Middle East and North Africa. So today's topic is about my book, The Privatization of Warfare. And what I have done with this book is effectively, I have looked at what kind of actors, political actors exist within Iraq and the Middle East when it comes to waging private warfare. In other words, mercenaries especially. So let's see if we can get this started. Yes, so I will go through some facts and figures about private military companies, and I want to talk about Abu Ghraib and the Nisour Square massacre. These are incidents that occurred in Iraq involving private contractors. I will then discuss briefly what kind of international law do we have in place to govern private military companies. And I also want to talk a bit about Syria as well and discuss what's happening with Syria and Russia especially. So firstly, one of the things that's interesting about private military companies is the fact that a lot of the literature is on or about American companies. And we forget the fact that many of them come from the EU, from Europe, as opposed to the States. And this is an issue also because when you look at private military companies, you also have other terms such as private security company. There is no legally binding definition for such a company. A security company could also be, for example, a company guarding a bank in the States, in a shopping mall. That's also a security company. What we're talking about here, we're talking about companies that have been deployed in the Middle East. And so we're talking about companies that are tasked with various forms of protection services, and to what extent are they actually protective versus being aggressive and getting involved in warfare. So the kind of services that most private military companies will provide, they can be land-based, maritime-based, or a combination of both. I have to say, to be honest with you, my work covers more land-based security. However, I do believe that in the Strait of Hormuz, especially after tensions with Iran, we will see more maritime issues coming to the fore. Already when there were tensions a few months ago, I believe it was even before that, there were certain maritime security companies who told nationals from specific countries who were working for them, you need to go home. You know, if you're British, for example, go home. There we are. Yes, so I do believe maritime security is going to increase over the next couple of years off the coast of Yemen, Somalia, of course the Strait of Hormuz as well. But really it started in a sense with land-based security, land-based private military firms.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, hello everyone. Rob, good to see you. I'm just going to put you on mute during the lecture. Hi there. And then after the lecture is done, people can ask their questions. But thank you for joining us. Thank you very much. It's good to see you. Okay, so when we talk about private military firms, one of the most infamous firms is Blackwater. This is a company that has changed its name several times. And so one of the things that my book looked at was Nisour Square and Abu Ghraib, these two incidents in Iraq involving private contractors. So the Abu Ghraib abuse scandals happened roughly in late 2003, and I'm still very surprised by the fact that the prison in question remained open up until 2014. That to me is just astounding. I just, I can't quite wrap my head around it, but there you go. So, well, one moment. Yes, so the Abu Ghraib abuse scandals took place in late 2003. And in 2004, of course, there was a huge reaction over what occurred. Now, I want to mention, while I recall that the Abu Ghraib prison was used by Saddam Hussein before his overthrow. It was then taken over by various forces. And from there, the coalition started to bring prisoners and whatnot. We will never fully know what things would have been like with social media. So for example, if we had social media, Facebook, Twitter, back in 2004, would the reaction have spread more quickly? Quite possibly. What we found is, excuse me, in 2004, a lot of Iraqis, they were able to purchase photos of the abuses that occurred from various markets where you could buy pirated movies and such. So they saw these photos of Iraqi prisoners being abused. It was quite shocking, and of course there was a lot of outrage at that time. What's interesting about Abu Ghraib, however, is the fact that the involvement of private contractors was very limited. Donald Rumsfeld, who was the defense secretary at that time, claimed that there were less than 40 private contractors at Abu Ghraib, so it was really the US Armed Forces who perpetrated this kind of abuse. And there were two major companies involved. I want to point out here that these companies, the first one being Casey, had links to the US government from going back to the Cold War. So during this period, Casey and others had a good relationship with the government, and that led to further contracts in Iraq. They supplied up to 30 interrogators. They were known for weapons contracts during the Cold War, but then they diversified into IT and tech support. And here we have a problem, because you may notice these are not what we would call private military companies. These are IT companies. They're intelligence gathering companies. And this is part of the issue, the fact that in their contracts with the US government regarding Abu Ghraib, they promised to provide both open and closed, i.e. classified intelligence gathering. And they were told that they would gather human intelligence. There's a very vague stipulation in that contract, code word effectively for torture. And so again, we see here, there's a lack of accountability. And of course, you could argue it was done intentionally because the government doesn't want the contract to be scrutinized too heavily. Titan Inc. was the second company that was also at Abu Ghraib, at the prison. They also were involved in IT systems and related services. And at first it looked as if they did not take too much of a hit from the fallout after the photos of abuses were leaked. After Abu Ghraib, they received government contracts for up to 4,500 translators, which to me is astounding, but it just goes to show that the first reaction was really to try to go about business as usual. But as the photos came out and as the abuses were leaked and more talked about in media, of course, things started to happen. Titan Inc., they lost a merger with Lockheed Martin. They've denied abuses, but this has not gone away. So they really struggled, and up to 2019, even now, there have been lawsuits filed against these companies regarding what happened at Abu Ghraib. Now, I also want to talk about Blackwater, the infamous private military company owned by Eric Prince. They changed their name so many times I've lost count, but these individuals, these employees here in this photo, often when I'm lecturing, I ask my students, how would you describe these individuals? Do they look like employees? Would you call them employees? Would you call them guards? Would you call them staff members? These individuals, they look militaristic, don't they? They're standing next to some sort of truck. They have military gear, but they are not a member of any armed forces. They don't have any insignia. They don't have a country's flag. They don't have dog tags. That's very important. They don't have a form of identification. And this is part of the problem. Accountability. You have to remember, private military companies are companies. They are effectively for profit. Yet they engage in some cases in warfare and in also political influence abroad. This is a problem. So the Nisour Square incident, or massacre rather, happened in Baghdad, Iraq's capital, where Blackwater was found guilty of opening fire on up to 17 civilians. And so what happened then was they were found guilty, but we see here a difference between Abu Ghraib and Blackwater. The fact that in Abu Ghraib, we had limited contractors. With Blackwater and Nisour Square, we have a situation in which it's only contractors who were involved. And there was a lack of legal closure. There were a lot of attempts to attack Blackwater or to have some sort of legal remedy, but cases were thrown out of court. There was very little that Iraq could do at the time. What they did was they responded by withdrawing Blackwater's license to operate, and it was already expired. In 2019, so summer 2019, almost a year ago now, Nicholas Slatton, one of the soldiers, or staff members rather, was found guilty for his role as a Blackwater employee in this incident And he was sentenced, but a lot of people were saying, so what? That's one person out of how many others who were involved? There were 17 lives taken, and only one person has been found guilty. And I'll discuss that as well in a moment, the problem of how international law works or does not work. So we have here from the New York Times an Iraqi account of the killings. And basically, after a bomb explosion, Blackwater turned up, and at some point, they shot the male driver of one of the cars in front of traffic. When the female passenger began screaming, they shot her as well. After that, more Blackwater guards turned up and fired non-lethal sound bombs, but then, the damage was done. And again, notice the language here in New York Times, they call them guards. These are, remember, none of these terms have any legal validity. But, guards, soldier, mercenary, we use these terms freely, whereas I usually refer to them as staff members or employees, because legally that is what they are. So when Nisour Square happened in 2007, there was a huge media reaction, but the US investigation didn't really go anywhere. In 2009, the case was dismissed due to tampered evidence, in other words, a technicality. Iraq couldn't really do much. They withdrew Blackwater's license to operate, so that was one. But at this time, we start to see a rise of literature on private military companies asking, who are these guys? What are they doing in Iraq? How can they operate? How are they allowed to operate or not? What laws govern them? And at this point, we start to see certain authors like E.L. Gaston discuss the need for international law to actually recognize private military companies, that we need laws, international laws, governing non-state actors specifically that can do a lot of influence and a lot of damage. My book discusses the idea of getting both industry, so private military companies, governments, and civil society involved in a voluntary framework. So you bring everyone together to govern private military companies and ensure that the work they do has some sort of framework and that there's accountability. The Montreux document is one document under international law that discusses private military companies. It has some weaknesses that I'll discuss. Firstly, it determines permitted tasks. It doesn't necessarily talk about tasks that are prohibited, but it does argue for accountability through a licensing and contracting framework, the need to vet PMCs. This is very important because often what would happen is if a staff member of a PMC in Iraq is fired or let go because he shot someone or committed a crime, that person would leave Iraq and go back to the States, wait for 6 months, then they would return to Iraq and they would try to get hired with a separate company. And they may very well have gotten hired because these guys need boots on the ground. They needed boots on the ground as much as possible. And PMCs, these companies often did not share information with each other, so they wouldn't know that a former employee of Blackwater had committed a crime and he then goes and gets hired by another company. So both the US and Iraq are more than aware of the Montreux document. And the problem here with international law is it is voluntary. This is really, the Montreux document is a reminder of existing international law, which is governed, of course, by states. So state responsibility to control private military companies. The US is important in this setup, if you like, because they are a home and contracting state. In other words, there's a lot of American private military companies out there. They then are abroad in Iraq or in Libya and other places around the world that are conflict zones. And the US is a state of origin, but they also act as a client. And that's very important. So the fact that they are both the home state, but also a contracting state, that they actually hire these guys to do work abroad. And sometimes that work is very vaguely stipulated. And the issue here comes down to profit. Iraq and Afghanistan, from 2007 to 12 alone, we saw almost $200 billion worth of contracts. That's serious money, and it's the main reason why these industries are the way they are. They are effectively for profit. There are different regulations that exist in the states to try to come down on those who commit a crime. So, for example, the Military Extraterritorial Judicial Act, which argues that if you commit a crime as a member of the US Armed Forces and you're abroad, you will be punished for it back home. But the problem with this, of course, is that it doesn't take into account the fact that there's so many staff members of private military companies who are retired. They're no longer with the armed forces. In fact, there are some who argue that private military companies drain armed forces of talent. When I was in Turkey, I was lecturing on my book. And one professor, he approached me and he said, you know, I was in the military, I was drafted, and after my service was done, I decided to do my PhD, but I could have stayed. They, you know, the military wanted me to stay. And he said, you know, imagine if I had stayed and they had trained me further, and they invest time and money in training me, and then right after I get certain skills, along comes a private military company and they offer more money. So like they let the armed forces pour cash into training soldiers, and then they come along and they take these soldiers who now have expertise. Iraq, of course, is what we call a territorial state. So it is a state that hosts, not willingly of course, but it hosts private military companies. It hosts conflict, especially after 2003. We saw the increasing need for regulation, but we also saw the need for security, and private military companies, they jumped on this. Some of them, they exploded almost overnight. So in some cases, we saw private military companies that were created from one colonel in the US who still had contacts in Iraq and said, you know, I see an opportunity here. So he calls his buddies in Iraq and they put together a team, and suddenly they have a PMC. And this is an issue because also we see that private military companies have gotten politically involved. For example, they have tried to do deals with tribes in Iraq, which is really the government's job. And so suddenly when they have that kind of influence, that's problematic. It was for this reason that Iraq tried to push what's called the oil law in its energy sector. So a law which basically says that foreign companies, private military companies, cannot guard oil infrastructure or hydrocarbon infrastructure in Iraq. Only the Iraqi oil police can do that. And although that oil police has been underfunded and they've struggled, the point was to send a message to say, look, Iraq is open for business. We want your business. We want oil companies to come in, but we do not want foreign companies, American companies, British companies, security companies guarding our oil, because we know that's the first step to losing our sovereignty. I will also discuss PMCs in Syria as well. These are Russian PMCs, which I've written about more recently. They're much more aggressive, it seems, than American PMCs are. So from 1997 to 2013, there was a huge growth of Russian PMCs. And when they were debated in 2007, whether or not they should be licensed, the Duma, that's say Putin's parliament, said no. Why? Because if you start to license them, you acknowledge their existence. And that's a problem because they're being deployed in Syria in a way that allows Putin to deny that they're being used, to say, well, we're not active in Syria that way. You know, and he can say that because although certain companies like Wagner Group are being deployed there, he doesn't want to openly acknowledge that. And so we see how really Assad has been propped up through, among other things, Russian intervention, including the use of Russian military companies. So Assad is recognized on paper, but in reality, some of these guys, they come in and they provide security on a daily basis so they can also exploit certain resources. Now, this graph here that I've provided, one of the things that interested me in Wagner Group is the fact that they have a very structured overview here. And so we see in this instance, they are structured both like a company and like the military. You have an executive director, which perhaps is like a CEO, but you also have a commander, you have tank battalions, you know. And so while the US tries to sell its contractors as defensive, we protect, we secure, Russia is much more aggressive, much more military, and it shows how they are more willing to openly wage what I call hybrid warfare. So they assist Assad, they assist his armed forces, and they also bolster Russia's armed forces in Syria, and they create pockets of stability for Russian interests. They go in and they go out. This is an interesting issue when it comes to what I call militarized resource companies. So Putin has said that he wants to support the work that energy companies do. And what he means by that is also security. So Gazprom, which is Russia's biggest energy company, they have their own military with arms supplied by the Kremlin. And this is important because it means that suddenly you have non-state actors, transnational companies who are heavily armed, well-funded, and they probably have more influence than certain states, and they certainly would have more, so the equivalent GDP of a small state in some cases. So here we have Yevgeny Prigozhin seated next to Putin. This is a man who is linked both to Wagner Group, the PMC, and to Gazprom, and he has tried to negotiate deals in Syria. So in 2017, an energy deal to gain 25% of Syria's hydrocarbon fields in terms of shares, and then 1 year later, Moscow was going to get the sole rights to production in Syria in exchange for rebuilding the country after the war is over. Of course, who's going to guard those oil fields? Wagner Group would. And perhaps this is another reason why Putin, as you may have heard, is Wagner Group is pulling out of Libya. This has happened over the past couple of days, and it's left General Haftar in Libya in a very precarious position because he's lost a lot of territory. But it may also be Putin's way of saying, well, if we're not going to get everything we want in Libya, let's focus again on Syria. So if I look at Iraq, and we'll discuss Syria again in a moment, what my book asks is, what is the perception, the public perception of state use of private military companies? Is it accepted by the general public that we have privatized security and therefore privatized warfare? And so I looked at different media discourse from Arab, British, and US outlets discussing this regarding Nisour Square and, of course, the Abu Ghraib abuses as well. So it's interesting that with Nisour Square, a lot of Arab and British outlets labeled private military companies as security firms. So this is actually interesting because very few companies want to be called private military companies. When they were offered to work on the Montreux document, a lot of them said, we will not sign this document if you do not refer to us as private security companies. Do not refer to us as PMCs. If you use the word military, we're not going to endorse this at all. So I think that was very interesting. So when it comes to Nisour Square, there were a lot of outlets that labeled PMCs as security firms, but in a negative context. For example, private security contractor found guilty of Abu Ghraib abuses, or in this case, private security contractor opened fire on innocent civilians. CNN was an interesting exception because they actually used the term military company in some of their headlines, and I was very surprised by that. I didn't think they would do that, but they did. And my later research looked at how certain companies like Blackwater actually started to promote themselves as more aggressive after 2012. So they would use very aggressive language on their website, almost as if they were embracing the military atmosphere or the military discourse surrounding them, implying that they were happy to take on clients who wanted a company that could violate international law. So with Abu Ghraib itself, the prison scandal, we see consistent labeling here across all media outlets of both Casey and Titan as corporations, not contractors. So this is interesting because they were called US corporations, US Defense Corporation, for example. And what that tells me is that there's a strong expectation that the United States government reels these guys in and provides some sort of remedy, a legal remedy for what's happened. There's a strong tie between the state, in this case the US, and these companies, even if the headlines are in a negative light. One of the disturbing things I found, however, was that Casey, they were referred to as a US contractor before they settled out of court. And this is interesting. They tried to settle out of court with prisoners regarding the Abu Ghraib abuses, and those people had to sign a non-disclosure. When that happened, suddenly they were referred to once again as a defense contractor. So that defensive image, the image of providing security, which is what they want. And this leads us to question, where do you draw the line? Who's responsible for these abuses ultimately? Is it the companies that perpetrated them, or is it the state that they are from? Let's see here, yes. So I also will talk a bit about Russia and the US in Syria, because this is sort of the next case study, if you like. We have seen here, again, a state PMC nexus, which is much more aggressive. Russia's links to private military firms are much more aggressive than the US's, it would seem. So we saw in February 2018, the Battle of Khasham, which was a 4-hour firefight in Syria between Russian and Assad forces and US troops in former ISIS territory, which is quite ironic because Russia and the US have backed different offensives against ISIS in the past, yet here they were fighting. So when we look at this battle, what I did for my extended research after the book, I looked at the headlines regarding this firefight. So the New York Times discussed a 4-hour battle between Russian mercenaries and US commandos. Very interesting language. Here they are referred to, the Russian side, Wagner Group, as mercenaries. Yet the United States soldiers involved are called commandos. It's much more official language. Commando sounds more authoritative. It sounds more legitimate, whereas mercenary does not. Der Spiegel Online, which is a German outlet, discusses the deaths of Russian soldiers, not mercenaries, soldiers. So the language you see is different. And the final piece here it's from An-Nahar, which is a Lebanese paper. Very interesting. They use the term Qawat Sadama. Qawat Sadama is a Arabic term for shock force. So they call the Wagner Group a shock force that's doing Putin and Assad's dirty work. So the idea, as I said before, that they go in, they create stability for Russia's interests, and then they go out once they have what they want. So that's a very interesting examination of how these companies are perceived in Syria. So when I look at both Iraq and Syria, it seems that US firms, especially during their time in Iraq, have tried to construct themselves as defensive or protective. They want to be called private security companies. They want to be seen as a protective force, if you like. Now, this image can be very quickly revoked by any wrongdoing. So when we've had these scandals, you know, the media will jump on it and they'll talk about it. And when that happens, we see that public expectation is to basically turn around and say to the states of origin, what are you going to do about this? If it's a US company that's in trouble, a US contractor, a US military company like Blackwater, the United States is obligated to do something about it, even if it's just to have a court case and things are settled out of court. So what's disturbing about those results is that the way people see it in general is that legitimacy of outsourcing security, it's not so much about whether or not the state has its own security or whether it outsources security. It's a lot more about to what extent states are willing to punish those who do wrong and discipline them as well. Then again, we've also seen how some companies have settled out of court. And by doing that, the idea is they don't have to talk about what happened. The people who were hurt or tortured are not allowed to talk about what happened because they sign a non-disclosure and they get paid a sum of money. That approach by certain companies or contractors during the Abu Ghraib scandal has been challenged as late as now 2019, where they found that despite settling out of court, certain individuals still tried to pursue them. And last year, they attempted to argue that they were a sovereign state. So that legally speaking, they said, we are like a sovereign state, therefore we can't be sued. And of course, it was tossed out of court. But it just goes to show, just because you settle out of court and people aren't supposed to talk about it, doesn't mean that this issue goes away. So let's see here. So for Russia and Syria, again, language is very interesting. It depends on the outlet you're reading. The activity of Russia through Wagner Group are not soldiers, not officially, but they have worked with Russia's armed forces and Assad's armed forces. Sometimes they've gone into battle together. And that's very different because in Iraq, we saw US private military companies not necessarily working hand in hand with US armed forces, certainly not entering a firefight together. So the idea that Wagner Group is much more aggressive and that it's used as a way to do Putin's dirty work, that Wagner Group are an outsourcing of Russia's foreign policy. When I was in Finland and I was speaking for an NGO in Helsinki, there was a journalist present for my lecture who said that, private military company, because of what Putin is doing in Syria, private military company is not a very accurate term. He said that perhaps we would now call them a hybrid military company, rather than calling them a private military company because of the kind of work they're doing, the fact that they're getting so heavily involved in other states' affairs. So that is all from me regarding the presentation. So I will stop sharing now, but I definitely want to unmute everybody and take your questions as well. So please, everyone, let me unmute everybody. And whoever's got a question, go ahead and speak your mind. Let's have a look here. Unmute, unmute, and unmute. So yeah, you can also type your question here. I see that, for example, Isaac Hughes has asked a question about whether another war could happen potentially in this day and age. I would say it depends on the kind of war that you're talking about. I mean, wars are still happening, and that's still an issue. So
can I ask a question, Nikolai? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine, Rob. How are you? Good to see you.
Can I ask you, can you hear me clearly? Because people have been complaining in the past. They couldn't hear me clearly.
I cannot hear you clearly.
You can't hear me.
I can hear him fine, but I'll tell you what, Rob. why don't you ask your question, and also we can type it into the group chat. What's your question, Rob?
Well, I think it's more a comment, really.
Yes.
It's a question of accountability. So
Yes.
it seems to me the lines of accountability are so vague here. So you have, for example, a private military company operating in Iraq.
Yeah.
Now, presumably the employee is responsible to his or her employer, who is responsible to, then it becomes a little bit more vague. If they're working with the American military, I imagine there's some communication between the private military company and the American military. In turn, of course, that passes back to the Pentagon, I suppose, the State Department, and of course they've all got to obey international law. So it seems to me these lines of accountability are extremely vague. Can you comment on that?
Well, this is part of the problem, Rob, and for everyone else, just to paraphrase. So we're talking here about accountability and the lines that cross between private military companies and, let's say, the U.S. Armed Forces. Would they work together or not, and how does that accountability work? And Rob, to answer your question, we have a couple of things here. Firstly, we should not assume that the US or PMCs want to have clear accountability, because if you have a chain of command and it's very, very precise, that is how you may more easily prosecute people for wrongdoing. And that is not necessarily what people want. I mean, Russia's taking it one step further, because what they're saying is, with Putin, they're saying, no, we're going to basically do some dirty work through private military companies. I don't see how the US would necessarily not consider that as well. And so this is part of the issue with accountability, that there's been a lot of outsourcing, and let's remember the context in Iraq and other places. We're not talking about the US and others saying we want to enter Iraq with security forces, and we want to do that gradually and in a structured manner. Remember how it happened. It was very haphazard. Some companies were formed overnight. Some companies won a bid with the US government, to have boots on the ground, because they promised boots on the ground within 2 weeks of getting the contract, and then they had to resort to outsourcing themselves. So we have the US outsourcing security in Iraq, then we have the security or military company in question turning around and hiring, in this case I believe it was Gurkhas, to come to Iraq, who may have had not as extensive military training as others. So we have to remember the manner in which this was done, the manner in which the outsourcing took place, did not prioritize accountability. I don't think that it was supposed to.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, I see we also have a question from Mr. Desiree Custers about G4S, how they've been active in Iraq, working with the UN, demining and providing risk education. So the idea of a corporate responsibility framework from the training, recruiting men and women from the Yazidi community. This is a very interesting question. Thank you for this, Desiree. Thank you very much. I think that the idea of corporate responsibility is very, very important. And I think it's becoming more important as more and more people become aware of what kind of activities have taken place through private military companies. I'm not aware of private security companies working with the international coalition based in Iraq per se, but what has happened, what I can tell you, Desiree, is that among other things, some of these companies also have their own code of conduct, and I've actually analyzed them for the book. Of course, the issue is, why have a code of conduct if you're not going to practice it? And the answer is, it looks good. It's the same reason as, for example, why we have Vision 2020, Vision 2030 for oil states. It's to show that we're doing something. Unfortunately, some companies have done the same, and one of the issues here is everything is voluntary. So when we have certain companies that promise to abide by certain rules, really for those in the international humanitarian sector, it doesn't mean that things are changing per se. There's still a lot of skepticism over how they would perform in terms of obeying international law. Certain authors have even argued that the market has been segmented since Iraq. So you have certain PMCs that want to respect international law, and their clients are NGOs and states that want to maintain a good name. Then you have PMCs who are willing to violate international law and be more aggressive because that's what their clients want. Obviously, those guys do not want to be hired by NGOs. They want to be hired by the highest bidder. So, as one NGO executive told me in Geneva when I was doing research for the book, he said, look, if we have an international code of conduct, which by the way exists, the company can choose to follow it, and that means they get like a little gold star or a sticker on their name. If they don't follow it, then they don't get that little sticker, but that doesn't mean they don't get clients, and this is a problem. So yeah, so it's an ongoing issue. Any other questions? I think I've unmuted most of you. If you have not been unmuted, just text me and let me know so I can unmute you. I think, let's see here. Just gonna type, yep. So, no, but it's an ongoing issue with private military companies, and certainly you may notice, those of you who are interested in this subject, the fact that PMCs are active in war zones, in conflict zones, and this is part of the problem. This is where they make their money. They make the most money from conflict zones. Libya, Syria, of course, Iraq as well. Iraq is ongoing, and Afghanistan. Afghanistan is another case study that is seen as very profitable. And let's remember that it all comes down to profit.